Somewhere deep beneath the sands of Saudi Arabia, hidden inside underground tunnels that no satellite was supposed to find, there are missiles. Not small ones, not defensive ones. These are massive, long-range ballistic missiles, each one longer than a school bus, capable of traveling over 2,000 miles and leveling an entire city when they arrive. And here is the thing that kept Washington awake at night when they finally found out. America did not build them. America did not approve them. America did not even know they existed until the deal was already done. The missiles were already in the ground, and Chinese engineers were already standing in the Saudi desert, smiling. That discovery, made by the CIA in early 1988, was not just an intelligence failure. It was a signal that the most trusted, most oil-rich, most heavily armed American ally in the Middle East had quietly, carefully, and deliberately gone behind America's back. Not because it hated America, not because it had chosen China over the West, but because America had said no, and China had said yes. And in the world of weapons and power, that difference, the difference between yes and no, is everything. This is not a story that began last year. It did not begin with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. It did not begin with trade wars or artificial intelligence or rise of TikTok. This story began in 1985, in a meeting between a Saudi ambassador and American officials, where a king who was afraid of his neighbors sat down and asked for the tools to protect his country, and was turned away. That moment, 40 years ago, planted a seed in the desert, and what has grown from it today is shaking the foundations of American power in the Middle East, in ways the world is only beginning to fully understand. So let us start at the very beginning. Let us start with why. Saudi Arabia in the mid-1980s was a kingdom surrounded by danger. To the north, Iraq and Iran were locked in one of the most brutal wars the modern world had ever seen, a conflict that had already killed hundreds of thousands of people and showed no signs of stopping. To the west, across the Red Sea, tensions in the Horn of Africa were rising. And sitting right next to Saudi Arabia in the region was Israel, a country armed with the most advanced American military technology on Earth, technology that was legally protected by Washington, so that Israel would always have a military edge over every single Arab neighbor around it. Saudi Arabia was sitting on 1/4 of the world's proven oil reserves, making it the single most economically important country in the Middle East. It was also, militarily speaking, exposed. The kingdom's air force was strong. Its American-built tanks were good. But what it lacked, what kept its military planners awake at night, was the ability to reach far, to threaten any enemy who threatened it from a distance before that enemy could get close. Saudi Arabia needed long-range ballistic missiles, and so King Fahd sent his most trusted diplomat, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the Saudi ambassador to Washington, to make the ask. The Americans said no, flat no, firm no. Not because they did not trust Saudi Arabia, not because they thought the kingdom would start a war, but because American law was clear, and American policy was even clearer. The United States had a legal obligation to ensure that Israel maintained what was called a qualitative military edge over every other military in the Middle East. Selling long-range ballistic missiles to Saudi Arabia would tip that balance. Congress would never allow it, and so the door closed. Prince Bandar flew home empty-handed, but Prince Bandar did not go back to Riyadh and give up. He booked a flight to Beijing. What happened between 1985 and 1987 is one of the most extraordinary, most secretive, and most consequential arms deals in the history of the modern world. The Saudis and the Chinese negotiated a transaction that neither side would publicly acknowledge for years. It was given a code name, Project U, and it was executed with a level of secrecy that fooled American intelligence entirely. China agreed to sell Saudi Arabia between 30 and 120 Dongfeng 3 ballistic missiles. In English, Dongfeng means east wind. These were enormous weapons, each one 24 meters long, originally designed by China to carry nuclear warheads deep into Soviet territory. China stripped the nuclear tips. They fitted the missiles with 3,000 pounds of conventional explosives. And then they transported them to Saudi Arabia hidden inside shipments of regular, conventional Chinese weapons, disguised so thoroughly that American spy satellites and intelligence analysts did not catch it. The missiles arrived. Underground bases, WW. Air constructed by Chinese engineers in the Saudi desert. And when the CIA finally figured out what had happened in January 1988, it was completely over. The deal was done. The missiles were in the ground, and Saudi Arabia had become, almost overnight, the first Arab country with a long-range ballistic missile force. Washington was furious, but there was nothing left to do. So they did the next best thing. They swallowed their anger, stayed quiet, and pretended it had not happened. But it had happened, and it was never forgotten on either side. Then came 2007. 2 decades had passed, and the old Dongfeng 3 missiles were now outdated relics. Accurate enough when they were built, they were now far too imprecise for modern warfare. The Saudis needed an upgrade, They needed something newer, something faster, something that could actually hit what they were aiming at. So they approached Washington again. They asked for access to modern American ballistic missile technology. And once again, the same wall, the same policy, the same answer. No. The United States was not going to give Saudi Arabia advanced ballistic missiles. Israel's military edge came first, Saudi security came second. So Saudi Arabia went back to China, and China was ready with something far better than the old east wind. The Dongfeng 21, a road mobile ballistic missile that can be driven through the desert on a truck, hidden under camouflage netting, and launched within minutes of receiving an order. Its range exceeded 2,150 kilometers. Its accuracy was in a completely different league from the old DF-3, and it was available for the right price with the right understanding between governments. The deal was completed quietly, so quietly that the public did not learn of it for years. When a 2014 investigative report revealed the transfer, it included a stunning detail that CIA officers had actually been allowed to physically inspect the missiles in their shipping crates before they left China. Not to stop the sale, but to verify that the warheads were conventional and not nuclear, so that Washington could maintain the fiction that nothing too alarming had happened. Think about that. The United States government knew. They sent their own intelligence officers to look. And then they nodded, looked away, and said nothing in public. Because admitting the truth would have meant admitting that their closest Gulf ally had a growing Chinese missile arsenal hidden in the desert, and that the United States had known about it for years and done nothing. Then came 2021, and satellite images that shocked the world. Analysts at various defense think tanks were scanning commercial satellite photos of Saudi Arabia when they noticed something unusual being constructed inside of the kingdom. Buildings that looked like manufacturing facilities. Specialized infrastructure. The kind of layout that experts in ballistic missile programs recognized immediately. Saudi Arabia was not just importing Chinese missiles anymore. Saudi Arabia was building its own missiles, on its own soil, inside its own borders, with Chinese engineers on the ground providing technical knowledge and hands-on assistance to make it happen. The Saudis were constructing a facility for the domestic production of solid-fueled ballistic missiles. This matters enormously because solid-fueled missiles are completely different from the older, liquid-fueled types. Solid-fueled missiles can be launched far faster. You do not have to fuel them before firing, which takes time and creates vulnerability. They are easier to conceal and harder for an enemy to destroy before they take off. They represent a genuinely sophisticated military capability that no other Arab country had ever achieved domestically, outside of Iran. And Saudi Arabia was doing it with Chinese help, right there in the open, and nobody in Washington said anything public. Lie, because saying something publicly would have required explaining why it was happening. And the reason it was happening was the same reason it had always been happening. America kept saying no. June 2025, the system that had made Iran's air defense credible for nearly a decade was already 8 months in the past tense. Iran also developed and deployed its own domestically built air defense system called the Bavar 373. Iranian officials described it publicly as Iran's indigenous answer to the S-300. And in some press conferences and military parades, they claimed it was actually superior to Russian systems. They said it could track multiple targets simultaneously. They said it had a range that exceeded the S-300. They said the upgraded version, featuring a missile called the Syed 4B, could engage targets at up to 300 kilometers and track up to 300 separate targets at once. And Iran pointed to the Bavar 373 as the pride of its domestic defense industry. Proof that Iran could develop world-class military technology independent of foreign suppliers. On a test range, against known targets flying predictable flight paths in controlled conditions, the Bavar 373 may well perform as advertised. But there's a fundamental difference between test range performance and combat performance, when every variable is working against you at once. When stealth jets are approaching from unexpected vectors, when electronic jamming is flooding your radar frequencies with noise, when your communication links have been degraded by 9 days of Israeli strikes, when your command structure has been disrupted, and when the approaching aircraft are flying profiles specifically designed to exploit every weakness in your system simultaneously. Under those real-world, real combat conditions, the Bavar 373 produced the same result as everything else Iran had on the night of June 22nd. Complete silence. Iran also had the Khordad-15 system, another domestically developed air defense weapon that Iranian state media covered extensively with great pride. The Khordad-15 uses a passive phased array radar and was specifically designed, according to Iranian military officials, to detect and engage stealth aircraft. Iranian television programs showed simulations of the Khordad-15 tracking and destroying F-35 fighters. Iranian commanders gave interviews claiming the system could detect stealth jets at 85 kilometers and engage them within 45 kilometers. The narrative inside Iran was that the Khordad-15 represented a genuine breakthrough, that Iran had solved the stealth problem. What the Khordad-15 actually demonstrated on the night of June 22, 2025, and during the 9 days of Israeli strikes before it, was that there is an enormous difference between a simulated capability and a proven one. Iranian radar operators and missile crews never got a reliable targeting solution on incoming stealth aircraft. The systems that survived Israeli strikes were not able to generate the kind of clean, sustained radar lock required to actually fire a missile with any realistic probability of hitting a fifth-generation stealth jet. And many of the Khordad-15 batteries that might have been positioned to try simply were not there anymore, having already been struck in the preceding days of the conflict. Beyond the hardware failures, there's a dimension of this story that most people never hear about. And it is arguably the most decisive factor in why Iran is completely blind to American stealth operations. That dimension is electronic warfare. The United States military does not send stealth jets into hostile airspace alone. Alongside every stealth strike package operates a fleet of specialized aircraft whose entire purpose is not to drop bombs, but to attack the electromagnetic spectrum itself, to reach out invisibly through the air and destroy Iran's ability to use its own radar systems. The primary weapon for this is the EA-18G Growler, a highly specialized aircraft derived from the FA-18 Super Hornet. But instead of bombs and missiles, it carries powerful jamming pods that emit high-power electronic signals, specifically tuned to the frequencies used by Iranian air defense radars. When an EA-18G Growler activates its jamming system, Iranian radar operators do not see stealth jets on their screens. They do not even see clean, empty screens. They see white noise, overwhelming, blinding interference that turns every radar display into chaos. The Growler identifies every frequency that an Iranian radar system is actively using, and then floods that frequency with so much electronic noise that the radar becomes useless. Iranian operators who are already struggling to detect stealth aircraft with radar cross-sections the size of marbles are now also fighting through electronic blizzards that make it impossible to tell the difference between an aircraft, interference, noise, and nothing at all. And then there is the trap that comes with attempting to fight back against jamming. If an Iranian radar operator, frustrated and desperate to find the incoming aircraft, decides to increase the power output of his radar, trying to push through the jamming by simply broadcasting more energy, that increased radar emission becomes a targeting signal. The United States has a weapon called the AGM-88 High-Speed Anti-Radiation Missile, or HARM. This missile is specifically designed to detect, home in on, and physically destroy radar transmitters. It follows the radar signal like a bullet following a muzzle flash. If an Iranian radar station increases its output trying to burn through electronic jamming, an AGM-88 is already in the air before the operator realizes what is happening, traveling at over twice the speed of sound directly toward the source of that radar signal. The message to every Iranian radar operator in the airspace that night was brutally simple. Turn on your radar and you will be killed. Stay silent and you are blind. There is no third option. Consider what the United States has been doing in parallel with all the public commitment ceremonies and ribbon cuttings. In 2019, 6 years before the June 2025 strikes, the U.S. quietly transferred the Combined Air and Space Operations Center from Al Udeid to Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina. The Washington Post was invited to observe what OFO officials called a dress rehearsal. Moving the command center off Qatar's soil back to the continental Unios, TED states, away from the 190-kilometer gap between Qatar and Iran. American officials described it as training and exercises. Arab News described it more bluntly. The Americans are re-practicing for a future where Al Udeid no longer exists. That transfer in 2019 was not widely discussed. It did not generate much coverage. But it was a significant statement about how the United States internally assesses its own exposure. Yodi Dayu, ho not run a dress rehearsal for relocating your most important regional command center unless you are seriously considering the scenario where relocation becomes necessary. The pattern, then, is this. Publicly, the United States deepens its commitment to Al Udeid, security guarantees, new command facilities, joint training, billions in Qatari investment. The relationship is stronger than ever. Privately, the United States practices leaving, moves command functions to South Sierra Leone, evacuates personnel and aircraft before expected strikes, establishes the minimum acceptable DAMA-GE threshold so that base hits below that threshold don't require full military response. Qatar is caught in the middle of this tension. Qatar has invested more than $8 billion in a base that its American partner preemptively evacuates when threats escalate. Qatar signed a defense cooperation agreement, received an unprecedented formal security guarantee, and still watched Iranian missiles strike its territory. Qatar condemned the attack and immediately reaffirmed its commitment to American partnership. EP, because Qatar has no other choice. The entire foreign policy architecture of Qatar rests on the American military presence. Remove the Americans, And Qatar faces its neighbors, Saudi Arabia and Iran both, without a shield. Qatar knows this. The Qatari government understands that even an America that preemptively evacuates its base is better protection than no America at all. So Qatar keeps investing. Qatar offers the Idaho facility. Qatar accepts the sequential embarrassments. The base hit, the personnel moved out, the aircraft departed, because the alternative is worse. But there is a question hanging over all of this that no one in Washington or Doha has publicly answered. How many times can this cycle repeat before Tihi's strategic value of Al Udeid is fundamentally degraded? The base's power comes from its permanence and credibility. The Combined Air Operations Center directing 21 countries' worth of air campaigns works because everyone, allies and adversaries, assumes it will be there tomorrow. The forward headquarters of CENTCOM functions as a deterrent, partly because its presence signals American commitment to the region. The moment adversaries realize that the base empties before each major escalation, the credibility of that presence changes. It is no longer a permanent commitment. It is a presence that manages its own risk by temporarily retreating. That is a different kind of commitment, a conditional commitment. Iran has already drawn the lesson. January 2026's Iranian warnings to Gulf states, strike U.S. bases if America attacks Iran, were not a new threat. They were the institutionalization of a pattern that had already been proven effective. Iran proved in June 2025 that striking Al Udeid did not trigger a catastrophic American response. Iran proved that America would preemptively reduce its own presence in anticipation of a strike, effectively helping Iran's missiles find fewer targets. And now, 6 months later, the same cycle is running again. The 44 soldiers who stayed at the Patriot batteries in June 2025 understood the geography better than any briefing document. They were the young est people in the building. The base had been cleared, the planes were gone, the senior personnel had relocated, and they stayed with their missile batteries, watching TE radar for incoming threats, knowing that the entire protection of America's most important regional installation rested on their 2-minute engagement window. They held. The Patriot systems worked. Most of the missiles were destroyed. The base survived and sank functionally, structurally, operationally. But a radome was gone. A communications dome that had been part of Al Udeid's secure network for years was destroyed. And 2 minutes was all that separated a controlled incident from a catastrophe. The United States military is not retreating from Qatar. Not fully, not yet. The formal commitments are real. The investment is real. The 10,000 troops, when they are present, are real. The new combined command post, the Idaho training facility, the security guarantee, all of it represents genuine strategic depth in a relationship that both countries need. But the geography is also real. Qatar is 190 kilometers from Iran. The missiles are faster than decisions. And the clearest statement about Al Udeid's Al strategic posture is not found in any press release or announced what it called Operation Annunciation of Victory, a missile barrage targeting Al Udeid directly. Iran said it launched a powerful and devastating attack, and that U.S. bases in the region were not points of strength but major vulnerabilities. 7 missiles were fired from Iranian territory, short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles, according to a U.S. defense official. Qatar confirmed the launch, saying its authorities had received reports of 7 missiles heading toward Al Udeid. The base scrambled its defenses. Inside Al Udeid, 44 American soldiers had stayed behind to operate the Patriot air defense systems. The oldest among them was a 28-year-old captain. The youngest was 21. They had flown in specifically for this moment. Patriot crews who had been stationed in South Korea and Japan brought to Qatar to bolster the base's defenses. They had roughly 2 minutes to succeed or fail. 2 minutes from detection to intercept, with Iranian ballistic missiles descending on their position. The Patriot systems fired. Most of the incoming missiles were destroyed, but one got through. It struck a radome on the base, the large white dome that housed American secure communications equipment. Satellite images from Planet Labs confirmed the destruction. The radome was gone. The communications infrastructure it protected was damaged. Iran claimed 6 missiles had successfully hit the base. American and Qatari officials said the damage was limited at the radome and that there were no casualties. Qatar's defense minister confirmed that air defenses had intercepted the main bar. Rage. Outside the base, explosions were visible from Doha, the capital, 45 minutes away by road. The embassy issued a shelter-in-place warning for American citizens. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, later called it the largest single Patriot engagement in U.S. military history. One engagement, 44 soldiers, 2 minutes. The entire communications dome of the most important U.S. military base in the Middle East destroyed. And here is what that moment exposed. The preemptive evacuation of Al Udeid was not a precaution taken out of abundance of caution. It was the American military acknowledging, in the clearest possible operational terms, that Al Udeid cannot be defended in place during a real exchange with Iran. The base is too close. The missiles are too fast. The only viable strategy, when Iran decides to strike, is to move the people and the planes before the missiles arrive. That is not the posture E of a superpower defending its territory. That is the posture of a military that has accepted its own geographic exposure. The world noticed that sequence. Iran struck Qatar. Then America issued the guarantee. That ordering of events matters. It suggests the guarantee was not deterrence, or it was damage control, a way of reassuring Qatar that the United States was still committed, after the fact, after the missiles had already landed. October brought another development. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth flew to the Pentagon and signed a letter of agreement with Qatar's defense minister. The United States and Qatar would build a Qatari Air Force facility at Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho. Qatar would bring F-15 fighter jets to American soil. Pilots would train together. Interoperability, the military word for making sure two different countries' forces can actually operate together in a real fight, would deepen. It was unprecedented. Qatar, a nation the size of Connecticut, was being invited to operate military aircraft on U.S. territory. The official explanation was mutual training and shared readiness. But the underlying message was equally clear. This relationship is not just about America protecting Qatar. This relationship now goes both ways. Qatar's Air Force trains in Idaho. America's headquarters stays in Doha. The dependency is becoming mutual. In November 2025, the U.S. and Qatar cut the ribbon on the Middle East's first combined command post for air defense, right there at Al Udeid. Admiral Brad Cooper, the CENTCOM commander, stood at the ceremony and said the military-to-military relationship with Qatar was stronger than ever. The new facility would allow American and Qatari forces, alongside personnel from other regional partners, to coordinate air and missile defense in real time. 17 nations, one operations center, all of it headquartered at the base that Iran had struck just 5 months earlier. From the outside, it looked like strength, and in some ways it was. The investment, the coordination, the joint command structure. These are real capabilities that make the base harder to overwhelm. But underneath the ribbon cutting and the press releases, the geography had not changed. Qatar still sits 190 kilometers from Iran. The missiles are still faster than any decision-making process, and the base still has one fundamental vulnerability that no amount of Patriot batteries can completely eliminate. It is there, it is known, and its coordinates have been in Iranian targeting databases for years. Then came January 2026. Iran's government was in crisis. Massive anti-government protests had erupted across the country in the final days of 2025, triggered by economic collapse and a currency in freefall. The protests spread fast and hard. Reports from human rights organizations estimated that by mid-January 2026, Iranian security forces had killed more than 2,400 protesters, with some estimates placing the toll as high as 20,000. Over 18,000 people had been arrested. Communications and internet access were being cut city by city to prevent footage from reaching the outside world. Trump was watching, and Trump was threatening. He took to Truth Social with messages urging Iranian protesters to keep fighting. He said help was on the way. He canceled meetings with Iranian officials. He threatened tariffs against any country doing business with Iran. He told a CBS News anchor he would take very strong action if the Iranian regime began executing protesters. And behind the public statements, the briefings were happening. The president was receiving presentations on military and covert options for targeting Iran. Tehran heard all of it, and Tehran responded in a way that made the threat concrete. A senior Iranian official contacted governments across the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, and others, and delivered a direct message. If the United States strikes Iran, every U.S. military base in your country will be attacked. Not a vague threat, a specific, formal diplomatic notification. Iran was telling its neighbors, hosting American forces has consequences. The clock is running. On the morning of January 14th, 2026, Reuters broke the story. The United States was withdrawing personnel from Al Udeid. Hundreds of troops were being moved off the base and relocated to hotels and other facilities across the region. Qatar's government confirmed it in an official statement. The departure of certain personnel from Al Udeid was happening in response to current regional tensions. Qatar said it was taking all necessary measures to protect its citizens, residents, and critical infrastructure. Open-source flight tracking data caught what the official statements did not say. At least 6 U.S. Air Force KC-135 Stratotanker refueling aircraft departed Al Udeid around 10 in the evening local time, heading south toward Saudi Arabia. Those tankers are among the most important aircraft in any U.S.